September 14th, 1923. The river town of Iquitos, Peru, smelled of rubber and rotting fruit in the afternoon heat. Thomas Aldridge stood on the wooden dock with everything he owned in a canvas rucksack: 2 changes of clothes, a hunting knife his father had given him before the fever took him, a water-stained copy of Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle, and exactly $7 folded into his sock. The humidity wrapped around him like a wet blanket. Sweat trickled down his spine and pooled at his collar. The dock planks were soft with rot, and somewhere beneath them, the brown Amazon water churned with things that swam and things that waited. A steamboat was loading upstream, its whistle cutting through the afternoon air, carrying rubber barons and their servants back to the coastal cities where money still meant something. "You're not welcome here anymore," his uncle had said that morning, the words delivered without looking up from his ledger. 16 is old enough to make your own way. The company has no use for boys who ask questions and slow down the work. Thomas had not argued. There was no point. His uncle had taken him in after his parents died of yellow fever 3 years ago, not out of love, but because Thomas could read and write and keep the plantation's accounts, while the real clerks drank themselves senseless by noon. Now that the rubber market had collapsed and the plantation was failing, Thomas had become just another mouth to feed. The foreman, a thick-necked man named Vargas, had escorted Thomas to the dock and pressed a single coin into his palm, a $5 piece, cold and final. "Don't come back, boy," Vargas had said, though not unkindly. "There's nothing here for you now. There's nothing here for any of us." Thomas watched the brown water of the Amazon slide past the pilings. Somewhere upriver, howler monkeys screamed their territorial claims. The sound echoed across the water like laughter or perhaps a warning. He had no plan, no family, no country that wanted him back. His parents had been naturalists who had given up their comfortable English lives to chase specimens through the jungle, and England was now just a word in his mother's faded letters. He was 16 years old, alone in the most remote corner of the world, with $5 and a knife. The dockmaster, an old mestizo with cataracts clouding his left eye, watched Thomas with the patient curiosity of a man who had seen 1,000 stories begin and end on this same stretch of rotting wood. "Looking for work, young man?" Thomas shook his head. "Looking for somewhere to go." The old man laughed, a sound like dry leaves. "In this town, that's the same thing. But if you're not particular—" He gestured upriver with his chin. "There's a cabin about 4 hours by canoe, up the Napo tributary. Old Sebastian's place. He died last month. Fever." The dockmaster shrugged. "His widow wants nothing to do with it. Says it's cursed. She'll sell it for whatever you've got in your pocket." Thomas felt the $5 piece through the thin fabric of his sock. A cabin. More of a hut, really. Raised floor, thatch roof. Sebastian was a collector. Plants, insects, that sort of thing. Sold specimens to the naturalists when they came through. "The jungle's already taking the place back, I expect." The dockmaster studied Thomas with his one good eye. "You know anything about the jungle, boy?" Thomas thought of the 3 years he had spent at his uncle's plantation, listening to the workers talk about which plants could kill you and which could save your life, watching the way the jungle crept back every time they cleared a new section of trees. He thought of his parents, who had taught him to look, really look, at the natural world before they died. "Some," he said. The dockmaster nodded. "That's more than most who come here. The widow's name is Maria Elena. You'll find her at the church. Tell her Ernesto sent you." The canoe Thomas borrowed from a fisherman in exchange for a handwritten IOU and a promise to return it within the week was barely 8 feet long and leaked steadily through a crack in the hull. By the time he reached the tributary the dockmaster had described, his trousers were soaked to the knee and his arms burned from paddling against the current. The jungle closed in around him like a living wall. Ceiba trees rose 100 feet or more, their buttress roots spreading across the forest floor like the fingers of giants. Lianas hung in thick curtains from the canopy, and the air itself seemed to sweat, heavy with moisture and the green smell of growing things. Thomas could hear birds calling in the upper branches, the harsh cry of macaws, the liquid whistle of oropendolas, but he could rarely see them through the layers of leaves. He found the cabin just as the afternoon rain began, a sudden downpour that turned the world into a gray curtain of water. The structure sat on stilts about 4 feet above the ground, its palm thatch roof sagging in places, but still mostly intact. A crude ladder led up to a platform that served as both porch and workspace, and Thomas could see the remains of drying racks and specimen jars through the open doorway. He tied the canoe to one of the stilts and climbed up, grateful to be out of the rain. The cabin was a single room, perhaps 12 feet square, with a sleeping platform along one wall and shelves along the others. Most of the shelves were empty, but a few still held glass jars with faded labels and the dried husks of insects. A small clay stove sat in one corner, its chimney pipe extending through the roof. The floor was covered in dead leaves and the droppings of some small animal, but the structure itself was sound. Thomas walked the perimeter, testing the bamboo poles and the lashings that held them together. Sebastian had known what he was doing. The floor joists were raised high enough to stay above the seasonal floods, and the roof was pitched at a steep angle to shed the rain. But it was what Thomas found beneath the sleeping platform that made him catch his breath. A trap door, cleverly concealed by a woven mat, opened onto a narrow shaft that dropped into darkness. Thomas lit the stub of a candle he found on one of the shelves and lowered himself through the opening. The shaft was about 6 feet deep, cut through the clay soil and into solid limestone beneath. At the bottom, a natural cave extended back into the darkness, its ceiling dripping with moisture and its floor covered in a fine white sand. The air was cool, startlingly cool after the oppressive heat above. Thomas held his candle high and guessed the temperature at perhaps 68 degrees, maybe 70. Above ground, even in the shade, the jungle rarely dropped below 85. He explored further, stooping to avoid the low ceiling. The cave was perhaps 30 feet deep and 15 feet wide, with several smaller chambers branching off from the main passage. In one of these chambers, he found Sebastian's true collection. Rows upon rows of specimen jars lined rough-hewn shelves carved into the limestone. But these were not the dusty, neglected jars from the cabin above. These were perfectly preserved, their contents floating in clear liquid that caught the candlelight like amber. And the labels. Thomas leaned closer, his heart beginning to pound. The labels were written in a careful scientific hand, each one detailing not just the species name, but the medicinal properties and preparation methods of the plant or insect within. Thomas recognized some of the names from his parents' work: cinchona bark, the source of quinine; cat's claw, which the indigenous healers used for inflammation; dragon's blood, the red tree sap that stopped bleeding. But there were dozens of others he had never seen, their labels describing treatments for fevers, infections, pain, and diseases he could barely pronounce. And at the back of the chamber, wrapped in oilcloth and protected from the moisture, he found Sebastian's journals, 3 leather-bound volumes, their pages dense with observations, sketches, and meticulous records of 30 years spent learning the jungle's secrets. Thomas sat on the cool sand floor, the candle burning down in his hand, and began to read. The first month was the hardest. Thomas had enough money left after buying the cabin. Maria Elena had indeed taken his $5 without question, pressing a small wooden crucifix into his palm, as if he would need divine protection more than cash, to purchase basic supplies from a trader who passed by every 2 weeks. Rice, salt, a machete to replace the one Sebastian's widow had taken, fishing line and hooks, a mosquito net that was more patches than original fabric. But supplies only kept you alive. They didn't teach you how to live. Thomas learned by doing and by failing. He learned that fish were easiest to catch at dawn when they rose to feed on insects that had fallen into the water overnight. He learned that the small red ants that invaded his rice cache could be deterred by hanging the container from a rope greased with palm oil. He learned that the clay stove needed to be fed small pieces of dry wood, never green branches, and that smoke management was as much about positioning as fuel. Too much smoke and you couldn't breathe. Too little and the mosquitoes would eat you alive. He learned that the jungle demanded systems, not heroics. Each morning before dawn, he checked his fishing lines. Each afternoon, he gathered firewood while it was still dry. Each evening, he wrote in his journal by candlelight, recording what had worked and what had failed. The routine became its own form of comfort, predictable rhythms in an unpredictable world. He learned, too, from Sebastian's journals. The old collector had been methodical in his observations, recording not just what he found, but how and why. One passage, dated March 1918, described the cave's natural cooling system in detail. The limestone draws moisture from the air, Sebastian had written, and the evaporation creates a cooling effect similar to a wet cloth placed on the forehead. The cave maintains a temperature of approximately 68 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the year, regardless of conditions above. I have begun storing my most sensitive specimens here, and find that they remain viable far longer than in the cabin. The indigenous people speak of similar caves throughout the region, which they use for preserving medicines and keeping water cool during the dry season. Thomas adapted the cave for his own purposes. He built a simple shelf system for storing food, extending the time his supplies would last. He rigged a series of clay pots to collect the moisture that condensed on the cave walls, providing a steady source of clean water even when the river ran brown with silt. And he began, slowly and carefully, to study the specimens Sebastian had left behind. The wet season arrived in November, with a violence that shocked Thomas, despite all his preparation. For 3 weeks, the rain fell without stopping, turning the forest floor into a swamp and raising the river until it lapped at the bottom of the cabin's stilts. The humidity above ground approached 100%, and everything Thomas owned began to sprout mold. His clothes, his blanket, even the leather cover of his Darwin book. Leeches appeared everywhere, on the ladder, on the cabin posts, even dropping from the thatch roof onto his sleeping platform. Thomas learned to check his body 3 times daily, running his hands over his ankles and calves where the parasites most often attached. He learned to burn them off with a smoldering stick rather than pulling, which left the mouth parts embedded in the flesh and invited infection. He moved into the cave. The cool, dry air preserved what the jungle tried to consume, and Thomas found himself spending more and more time below ground, reading Sebastian's journals by candlelight and studying the preserved specimens. He began to keep his own journal, recording his observations in the same methodical style, sketching the plants he encountered and noting which ones the jungle workers had told him were useful. When the trader passed by in December, Thomas asked about naturalists, whether any scientists ever came this far upriver, whether they might be interested in specimens. The trader, a heavy-set man named Gonzalo, who smelled of tobacco and river mud, laughed. Scientists? Here? He shook his head. The last one I saw was 3 years ago. Some Englishman who caught fever and had to be carried out on a stretcher. They come to Iquitos sometimes, but they never last long in the real jungle. He studied Thomas with new interest. Why? You got something to sell? Thomas thought of the hundreds of specimens in the cave below, the careful notes, the years of knowledge preserved in glass and leather. Maybe, he said. I'm still learning. Gonzalo grunted. Learning is for boys. Selling is for men. But he left behind a stack of old newspapers from Lima, and Thomas read them by candlelight, searching for any mention of scientific expeditions or universities that might be interested in the Amazon's secrets. The wet season stretched into February, and Thomas grew thin on rice and fish. His clothes began to rot despite his efforts to keep them dry, and he developed a cough that lingered for weeks. But he also grew stronger in ways that surprised him. His arms thickened from paddling and chopping wood. His eyes learned to pick out edible plants from poisonous ones, safe paths from treacherous ground. He could read the weather by the way the leaves turned before a storm, predict the river's rise by the behavior of the caimans that sunned themselves on the banks, and he continued to study. By the end of March, when the rains finally began to ease, Thomas had worked through all 3 of Sebastian's journals and begun to correlate the old collector's observations with his own. He had identified several plants that seemed promising for further study. One, a vine with heart-shaped leaves that the indigenous peoples used to treat infected wounds, showed remarkable antibacterial properties when he tested it on a cut on his own hand. He wrote a letter to the University of Lima's botanical department describing Sebastian's collection and his own preliminary observations. He gave the letter to Gonzalo in April, along with 3 carefully packed specimens and a small payment for postage. Don't expect a reply, Gonzalo warned. City people don't care about jungle boys. Thomas nodded. He had stopped expecting much from other people, but he had also stopped needing their approval to continue. The reply came 6 months later, in October 1924, just as Thomas was preparing for his second wet season. Gonzalo delivered it with something approaching respect in his voice, a thick envelope bearing the University of Lima's official seal and a smaller package wrapped in brown paper. Thomas opened the letter with hands that trembled slightly despite his efforts to stay calm. The package contained a magnifying lens of better quality than anything he had owned before, along with a set of proper specimen jars and preserving alcohol. The letter was from Dr. Eduardo Vasquez, professor of botanical medicine at the university. Thomas read it 3 times before the words fully registered. Your specimens have caused considerable excitement in our department, Dr. Vasquez wrote. The vine you describe, which we have tentatively identified as a previously undocumented species of Uncaria, shows antibacterial properties that surpass anything currently in use. If your observations regarding the preparation and application methods are accurate, this could represent a significant advancement in the treatment of tropical infections. We are assembling a small expedition to visit your location in January, weather permitting. Please confirm that you would be willing to guide our party and share access to the collection you describe. The university will provide appropriate compensation for your services and any specimens we acquire. Thomas sat on the cabin's porch, watching the evening light filter through the canopy, and felt something shift inside his chest. Not triumph exactly. The jungle had taught him that triumph was temporary, but something like vindication. The years of watching, learning, and refusing to give up had meant something after all. He spent the next 3 months preparing. He improved the trail from the river to the cabin, cutting back the vegetation and marking it with blazes that would be visible even in heavy rain. He expanded the sleeping platform to accommodate visitors and built a second shelter nearby, using the techniques Sebastian's journals had taught him. Bamboo frame, palm thatch pitched at a 45-degree angle, raised floor with good drainage. He organized Sebastian's collection, creating a detailed inventory and cross-referencing the specimens with the journal entries that described their properties. He prepared his own notes for review, checking and rechecking his observations against the physical evidence. The expedition arrived in late January. Dr. Vasquez, 2 graduate students, a photographer, and a young woman named Ana Lucia, who served as the expedition's translator and field assistant. She was perhaps a year older than Thomas, with dark hair pulled back in a practical braid and eyes that missed nothing. "You're younger than I expected," she said when they were introduced. It was not an insult, merely an observation. "I'm 17 now," Thomas said, "and I've been here a year and a half." Ana Lucia nodded, as if this explained something. "The professor was worried you might have exaggerated in your letters. Men often do when they're trying to impress." "I don't exaggerate," Thomas said. "I observe. Would you like to see the cave?" The expedition spent 2 weeks at the cabin, and in that time, Thomas's life changed completely. Dr. Vasquez confirmed that Sebastian's collection contained at least 7 species unknown to Western science, along with dozens of specimens that supported medicinal uses the indigenous peoples had known for centuries, but which had never been documented in formal scientific literature. Thomas watched the professor work with an intensity that surprised him. Vasquez moved through the cave like a man discovering a cathedral, stopping to examine each specimen, cross-referencing the labels with Sebastian's journals, occasionally letting out small exclamations of wonder. The graduate students took notes on everything: the temperature of the cave at various depths, the mineral composition of the limestone, the preservation techniques that Sebastian had employed. The cave, with its natural temperature control and preservation capabilities, impressed the professor even more than the specimens themselves. "This is a natural laboratory," he said, running his hands along the limestone walls. "The conditions here are better than most facilities in Lima. With proper development, this could become a center for tropical medicine research." Thomas showed them the vine. He had named it Aldrich's heartleaf in his notes, though the university would eventually give it a proper Latin classification and demonstrated the preparation method Sebastian had documented. Ana Lucia took careful notes while the photographer recorded everything on film. On the expedition's last night, Ana Lucia found Thomas on the cabin's porch, watching the fireflies drift through the understory like fallen stars. She sat beside him, without asking permission. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone bitter, maybe. Someone angry about being abandoned." She studied his profile in the dim light. "But you're not angry at all, are you?" Thomas considered the question seriously, as he considered all questions. "I was, at first. When my uncle sent me away, I thought I would never forgive him. But the jungle doesn't care about anger. It doesn't care about fairness or unfairness. It just is what it is, and you either learn to work with it or you die." He paused. "Anger was a luxury I couldn't afford, so I stopped being angry and started being useful instead." Ana Lucia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I grew up in an orphanage in Lima. The nuns taught us that suffering was God's way of testing us, but I never believed that. I think suffering is just suffering, and what matters is what you do with it afterward." Thomas turned to look at her. "You understand?" he said. It was not a question. "Maybe." She stood and brushed off her trousers. "The professor wants me to stay, to help you organize the collection and establish proper documentation protocols. He thinks this place could become something important." She paused. "Would that be acceptable to you?" Thomas felt something warm spread through his chest. Not attraction exactly, though that would come later, but recognition. The sense of meeting someone who saw the world the way he did. "Yes," he said. "I think it would." The years that followed were years of building. With funding from the university and, later, from international scientific organizations, Thomas transformed Sebastian's cabin into a proper research station. The original structure remained at the center, but additional buildings rose around it. A laboratory with proper equipment, sleeping quarters for visiting researchers, a small infirmary where local people could receive treatment using the medicines the station had helped develop. Thomas designed each new building using the principles he had learned from the jungle itself. All structures sat on stilts, their floors raised above the floodline. Roofs were pitched at the exact angle that shed rain most efficiently, 45 degrees, as Sebastian had noted, steep enough to prevent pooling, but not so steep that the wind could catch them. Cooking fires were positioned to create cross-ventilation that carried smoke away from living spaces while deterring mosquitoes. Every detail reflected years of careful observation. The cave became the heart of the operation. Thomas expanded it carefully, opening up new chambers for specimen storage and climate-controlled preservation. Engineers from Lima studied its natural cooling system and designed improvements that enhanced its effectiveness while respecting its essential character. By 1930, the cave could maintain temperatures and humidity levels that rivaled the best facilities in Europe or America. Ana Lucia stayed. She became Thomas's partner in the work, and eventually his partner in everything else. They married in 1928 in a small ceremony at the research station attended by Dr. Vasquez, a handful of colleagues, and representatives from the indigenous communities who had taught Thomas so much of what he knew. Their first child, a daughter they named Elena after the widow who had sold Thomas the cabin, was born the following year. News of Thomas's work spread slowly at first, then with increasing speed. The antibacterial vine, officially named Uncaria aldridgei by the Botanical Society, proved effective against a range of tropical infections, and preparations based on Sebastian's methods saved countless lives in the region. Other discoveries followed: a bark that reduced fever more effectively than aspirin, a fungus that showed promise in treating parasitic infections, a tree sap that accelerated wound healing. Thomas never forgot where the knowledge came from. He hired indigenous guides and healers as consultants, paying them fair wages and ensuring that their communities benefited from any commercial applications of their traditional medicines. He trained local young people as research assistants, giving them opportunities that had never existed before. He wrote papers and gave lectures, but he always gave credit to Sebastian, to the traditional healers, to everyone who had contributed to the collective understanding. His uncle's plantation failed completely in 1931, destroyed by the same market forces that had driven Thomas out 8 years earlier. Thomas heard the news without satisfaction. Revenge had never interested him. Success was a better answer than bitterness. The foreman, Vargas, appeared at the research station in 1935. Thin and graying and looking for work, Thomas hired him without comment, assigning him to manage the station's supply logistics, a job that used Vargas's practical skills without demanding the formal education he had never received. "You didn't have to do that," Ana Lucia said that night. "He was kind to me when no one else was," Thomas replied. "He gave me $5 when he could have given me nothing. That $5 bought me this place." He looked around the research station at the buildings and gardens and trails he had helped create. People aren't all one thing or another. They're just people, doing what they can with what they have. Ana Lucia kissed his cheek. "You're a better man than most." I'm a man who was lucky, Thomas said. Lucky to survive. Lucky to find this place. Lucky to find you. The least I can do is share some of that luck with others. The decades passed like the river flowing past the station's dock, steady, unstoppable, carrying everything forward. Thomas and Ana Lucia raised 3 children, all of whom inherited their parents' curiosity and dedication to the natural world. Elena became a physician who established clinics throughout the Amazon basin. Their son, Roberto, studied engineering and improved the cave system until it could preserve specimens indefinitely. Their youngest daughter, Maria, became a botanist like her father, discovering 7 new species before her 30th birthday. Thomas grew old, surrounded by the work he had built and the people he had trained. His hair turned white, his hands developed the tremor that comes with age, but his mind remained sharp. He continued to take notes until the end, observing the jungle's patterns with the same careful attention that had sustained him since he was 16 years old. In the summer of 1978, at the age of 71, Thomas felt the fever coming. He had survived it before, many times, over the years, but he knew this time was different. His body had finally reached the limits of what it could endure. He asked Ana Lucia to help him down to the cave. She was 72 herself, her hair fully gray and her joints stiff with arthritis, but she was still strong enough to support him down the shaft. They sat together on the cool sand floor, surrounded by the specimens that represented a lifetime of work, and Thomas spoke his last words. "Keep looking," he said. "That's all there is to it, really. Keep looking, keep learning, keep building. The jungle will teach you everything you need to know if you're patient enough to listen." He died 2 days later, peacefully, in the cabin where he had first discovered the secret that would shape his life. Ana Lucia lived another 12 years, continuing the work they had built together, training the next generation of researchers who would carry it forward. She was buried beside him on the hillside above the station, in a spot that overlooked both the river and the canopy they had loved so well. The Aldridge Research Station still operates today. The original cabin, carefully preserved and now designated a historical landmark, sits at the center of a complex that has grown to include dozens of buildings, 300 staff members, and partnerships with universities on 5 continents. The cave remains the heart of the operation, its natural climate control still superior to most artificial systems, its limestone walls still sweating the moisture that Thomas first noticed on a rainy September day more than a century ago. Modern scientists have validated many of the medicines Thomas and Sebastian documented. Uncaria aldridgei is now cultivated throughout the tropics, its antibacterial compounds used in treatments that have saved millions of lives. The dragon's blood sap has found applications in wound care. The fever-reducing bark has been synthesized and improved. Each discovery traces back, in some way, to the careful observations of a 16-year-old boy who had been thrown out of his uncle's house with $5 and a knife. Thomas's journals, 37 volumes spanning 55 years, are now housed in the station's climate-controlled archive. Researchers still consult them, finding insights that modern instruments had missed. His sketches of plants and insects remain accurate enough to be used for identification. His notes on indigenous medicinal practices have been corroborated by subsequent studies and have helped preserve knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. But perhaps his most lasting legacy is the approach he embodied: patient observation, careful documentation, and humble partnership with the natural world. The jungle, he always said, was not a wilderness to be conquered, but a teacher to be understood. It would punish those who came to exploit it and reward those who came to learn. His great-grandchildren still visit the station every summer, climbing down into the cave where Thomas first discovered Sebastian's secret, feeling the cool breath of the limestone against their faces. The youngest of them, a girl of 12 named after the great-grandmother she never knew, has begun to keep her own journal of observations. "What do you see?" the station's current director asks her. She looks around the cave with eyes that miss nothing, the same eyes that Thomas's daughter Elena had inherited, the same eyes that had first noticed the secret beneath the sleeping platform more than 100 years ago. "I see everything," she says, "and I'm going to write it all down." Above her, filtered through 100 feet of jungle canopy, the afternoon sunlight falls in broken columns onto the forest floor. The river whispers past the dock where Thomas first tied his leaking canoe. The howler monkeys call their territorial claims across the water, just as they did on that September day in 1923, when a boy with nothing discovered that the jungle had everything to teach him. The secret, Thomas wrote in his final journal entry, was never really a secret at all. It was simply this: pay attention. Be patient. Listen to what the world is trying to tell you, and then build something that will last. That's all survival ever was. That's all life ever is. Purpose was stronger medicine than rest. There's always more to find.